A woman kneels on the cold floor of a windowless chamber beneath the Cathedral of Toledo. The year is 1547. Her name was Maria de Cazalla before they took it away. Now she is simply the accused. Rough hands have hacked her hair down to bloody stubble. Iron shackles bite into wrists rubbed raw from 3 days of questioning. Around her, black-robed inquisitors move in practiced formation, their faces hidden beneath pointed hoods, transforming men of God into something far more sinister. She whispers a prayer in Spanish, not Latin. This simple act, praying in her native tongue rather than the Church's sacred language, has condemned her. The charge reads, heresy. But what it really means is that she dared to speak to God without permission, without intermediaries, without the elaborate machinery of institutional religion that demanded absolute submission. Listen carefully. That sound you hear? It's not whined through the stone corridors. It's the collected breath of 12 other women imprisoned in cells along this hallway, each awaiting their turn in this chamber. Each knowing that confession brings not mercy but merely a different flavor of horror. Here's what they never taught you in history class. Captured female heretics didn't just face torture or execution. The Church had perfected something far more sophisticated, punishments that weaponized faith itself against these women. Some would be transformed into living symbols of degradation, paraded through cities as broken warnings. Others would disappear into convents, not as nuns, but as slaves whose existence was slowly erased. The fortunate ones died quickly. The unfortunate discovered that the Church's imagination for suffering exceeded even hell's reputation. And buried in Vatican archives, locked away for centuries, are records of punishments so grotesque that even medieval chroniclers, men who described battlefield dismemberments with clinical detail, refused to document them fully. They would write only the usual penalties were applied, or justice was served according to custom, leaving historians to piece together from scattered clues what actually happened in those torch-lit chambers. What Maria doesn't know yet, kneeling on that stone floor, is that her captors have already decided her fate. The confession they're extracting through starvation and sleeplessness is merely bureaucratic procedure. Her punishment was chosen the moment she was denounced by her neighbor, a woman who coveted Maria's small cloth-dyeing business. She will not burn. Burning would make her a martyr, and the Inquisition has learned that martyrs inspire resistance. Instead, she faces something that will take years to kill her, something that will transform her from a woman who dared to think into a creature so broken that other women will cross themselves when they see what remains. The last punishment we'll explore tonight has been deliberately obscured from historical record. Not because it was too violent, the medieval world celebrated violence, but because it revealed something about power and control that even the Inquisition preferred to keep hidden. When you learn what they did to women whose only crime was reading the Bible in their own language, you'll understand why some secrets are buried deeper than graves. Before diving into these forgotten stories of institutional cruelty, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. They called it the question, as if torture could be reduced to punctuation. Medieval jurisprudence operated on a simple principle: pain produces truth. The Inquisitor's chamber was designed as a machine for manufacturing confessions, each element calculated to break down resistance before physical torture even began. Female heretics faced a system refined over centuries specifically to exploit every vulnerability women possessed in a world that already considered them barely human. The process started before arrest. Denunciation could come from anyone: a jealous neighbor, a rejected suitor, a daughter angry at her mother's discipline. The Inquisition paid informants, creating an economy of accusation where turning in heretics became more profitable than honest labor. Once denounced, a woman's fate was essentially sealed. In 500 years of operation, the Spanish Inquisition's acquittal rate was less than 2%. But mere accusation triggered immediate consequences. The moment Maria de Cazala's name appeared in the Inquisition's ledgers, she ceased to legally exist. Her property was seized for safekeeping. Her children were removed to protect them from corruption. Her husband was forbidden to speak her name or acknowledge their marriage. She became a non-person before ever seeing the inside of a cell. The arrest itself was choreographed humiliation. Inquisitors arrived at dawn, ensuring maximum witnesses. Maria was dragged from her bed in her nightclothes, denied even the dignity of dressing. Neighbors watched from doorways as she was loaded into a cage cart, the same type used for transporting animals to slaughter. The parallel was intentional. Transportation to the Inquisition's prison could take days. No food was provided, no water unless guards felt merciful, no privacy for bodily functions. By the time Maria reached Toledo's underground cells, she had already been systematically dehumanized, weakened, and isolated. The real interrogation hadn't even started. Those cells defied description, not through luxury or even particular squalor, but through calculated sensory deprivation. No windows, no variation in temperature, no way to tell day from night. The only sounds were distant screams, precisely timed to occur at irregular intervals, preventing sleep while building anticipation of future agony. Female prisoners faced unique degradations. Male guards conducted searches multiple times daily, hunting for diabolic marks or hidden items. These searches required complete nudity, spreading of limbs, invasive examination of every orifice. The pretext was security. The reality was systematic sexual humiliation designed to break down any sense of bodily autonomy or personal dignity. Here's where the Inquisition's genius for cruelty truly shone. They made their victims complicit in their own torture. Maria wasn't simply starved. She was given a daily choice between food and maintaining her innocence. Confess to heresy, receive bread, maintain innocence, receive nothing. After 5 days without food, watching other prisoners eat, most chose confession. But confession meant specifying crimes, and here the Inquisitors displayed their theological sadism. They wouldn't tell Maria what she was accused of. She had to guess, and each wrong guess was treated as evidence of additional crimes she was hiding. Confess to reading the Bible? Now, explain where you got it. Name who taught you to read. Identify everyone who knew and didn't report you. Each answer spawned 10 new questions, 10 new potential heresies, 10 new names to feed the Inquisition's endless appetite. The physical positioning during questioning was precisely calculated. Maria knelt on sharp stones while inquisitors sat elevated above her. She looked up into light sources that blinded her while keeping interrogators' faces in shadow. Her arms were bound behind her at an angle that started uncomfortable and progressed to agony over hours. This wasn't random cruelty, but studied manipulation of power dynamics. When simple questioning failed, they introduced demonstrations. Maria would be shown the instruments that awaited her, the rack that would dislocate every joint, the boots that would crush ankle bones to powder, the pears that would expand inside body cavities until tissue tore. She would watch other women undergo these tortures, their screams carrying through stone walls that conducted sound with horrifying clarity. Yet physical torture was often unnecessary. The Inquisition had discovered that uncertainty was more effective than pain. Maria didn't know when interrogation would come. Guards would drag her from her cell at random intervals, sometimes returning her immediately, sometimes keeping her standing naked in the chamber for hours without questioning. The anticipation of torture became torture itself. Sleep deprivation was their masterpiece. Not the crude denial of rest, but scientific destruction of circadian rhythm. Meals came at random times. Guards changed shifts unpredictably. Prayers were demanded at intervals that might be 2 hours or 20. Within a week, Maria couldn't tell if she'd been imprisoned for days or months. Reality became negotiable. The chamber itself was a psychological weapon. Latin phrases covered the walls, biblical verses about divine justice and the wages of sin. But mixed among them were names, hundreds of names of previous occupants, some crossed out, some circled, some accompanied by dates and cryptic symbols. Maria would stare at those names for hours, wondering if they survived, wondering if her name would join them, wondering if anyone would remember it existed. They broke her on the 8th day, not through torture but through kindness. A young inquisitor, barely out of seminary, brought her clean water and spoke gently about God's infinite mercy for repentant sinners. After a week of systematic brutalization, this tiny gesture of humanity shattered her remaining defenses. She confessed to everything, reading scripture, teaching her children prayers, believing she could speak directly to God without priestly mediation. The confession was meticulously recorded, read back to her for accuracy, signed with a hand that shook so badly the signature was illegible. Only then did they inform her that confession was not absolution but evidence. The trial would proceed. The confession simply determined which category of heretic she was, and therefore which variety of living hell awaited her. But confession guaranteed she would live, at least initially. Death would be too simple, too quick. The Inquisition had developed far more creative solutions for women who dared to define their own faith. Survival meant something different in the vocabulary of the Inquisition. When Maria learned she would not burn, relief lasted exactly as long as it took the Inquisitor to explain her sentence. Perpetual penance through service to God's representatives on earth. The words sounded almost merciful. The reality would make her pray for the flames she'd been spared. Female heretics who confessed faced a sadistic lottery. Some were sentenced to convents as slaves. Others were given to brothels as instruction in humility. A few were assigned as servants to the very families who had denounced them. Each fate was carefully chosen to maximize both suffering and social example. Maria drew the convent. But calling it a convent implies religious community, spiritual purpose, some fragment of dignity. What awaited Maria was none of these things. The convent of perpetual penitence was a prison where the church could hide its embarrassments. Mad nobles, pregnant nuns, and heretic women whose public execution might generate sympathy. She arrived wearing the San Benito, a yellow garment painted with devils and flames that marked her as condemned. She would wear this same garment, unwashed, for the remainder of her life. As it rotted, she would patch it. As it fell apart, she would hold it together with rough thread. But she could never remove it, never replace it, never escape its declaration of her damnation. The other nuns, real nuns, were forbidden to speak to her, look at her, or acknowledge her existence except when issuing orders. She was present but invisible, human but untouchable, alive but socially deceased. She slept on stone in the cellar with the rats. She ate scraps from the kitchen after even the dogs had been fed. She worked from before dawn until after midnight, every single day, without rest, without respite, without hope. Her duties were chosen for maximum degradation, cleaning latrines with her bare hands, washing menstrual rags by mouth, when the convent's water was reserved for pure residents, carrying corpses of elderly nuns to burial plots, then digging the graves alone while others prayed over the departed. Every task that could humiliate, exhaust, or endanger was reserved for the San Benito wearers. But physical labor was just the foundation. The true torture was spiritual. Every morning, Maria attended Mass but was forbidden from receiving communion. She watched others partake of salvation while knowing she was eternally excluded. She recited prayers but was told God wouldn't hear them. She confessed sins weekly, but was informed no absolution was possible for heretics, even repentant ones. The nuns devised exquisite psychological torments disguised as religious instruction. Maria would be forced to stand in the chapel holding heavy stones representing her sins while others prayed. If her arms dropped, if the stones fell, she was beaten for refusing to bear the weight of her crimes against God. These sessions lasted hours, Her arms would shake, muscles would cramp, but dropping those stones meant admitting spiritual weakness. Other women sentenced to brothels faced a different but equally calculated destruction. These weren't ordinary establishments, but special houses maintained by the church for fallen women beyond redemption. The theology was perverse. Since these heretics had already corrupted their souls through false belief, corrupting their bodies was simply making the outer match the inner. These church-operated brothels had rules that magnified the horror. The women received no payment. All money went to the church as penance revenue. They could refuse no customer, perform no act deemed too degrading, claim no illness or injury as excuse from service. But most sadistically, they were required to wear their sanbenitos during all encounters, ensuring every man who used them knew he was participating in holy punishment. Contemporary accounts, hidden in Inquisition archives and only recently analyzed, describe conditions that defy comprehension: women chained to beds for weeks at a time, available continuously, bodies so damaged from abuse that they could no longer walk, carried between rooms on boards, pregnancies that resulted in children automatically sentenced to the same fate as their mothers, creating generational slavery. Some heretic women were sentenced to a uniquely cruel form of servitude, returning to their own families as slaves. Imagine Maria standing in the doorway of the home she once managed, now property of the husband who was forced to denounce her or face his own trial. Her children taught to call her creature instead of mother. Her former servants, now her overseers, eager to prove their loyalty by maximizing her misery. These family sentences destroyed entire bloodlines. Children learned that their mother was subhuman, contaminated, dangerous to touch. They grew up watching her sleep with animals, eat from the floor, respond to commands but never speak unless ordered. Some developed psychological conditions, unable to reconcile memories of maternal love with the broken thing wearing their mother's face. The systematic branding and marking of these women ensured no escape through anonymity. Beyond the San Benito, many were tattooed with symbols of their heresy: crosses on foreheads, flames on cheeks, devils on hands. Even if they somehow escaped, their faces would betray them. Some desperate women tried to burn or cut away these marks, only to discover that self-mutilation was itself a crime punishable by escalating tortures. Document after document records the same phenomenon. Within 2 years, most sentenced women became unrecognizable. Not just physically, though starvation, beating, and endless labor transformed bodies quickly. But something fundamental broke in their minds. They stopped responding to their names. They forgot their children's faces. They repeated the same phrases obsessively: "I am nothing. I deserve this. God has abandoned me. I am nothing." The Inquisition celebrated these transformations as spiritual victories, proof that heresy could be literally beaten out of the human soul. They would parade these broken women during religious festivals, displaying them as warnings to other women who might dare question church authority. Yet even this living death wasn't the worst fate. Some women proved too strong, too resilient, maintaining their faith despite everything. For them, the Inquisition reserved special instruments designed not just to break bodies, but to make those bodies betray their owners in the most intimate ways possible. When conventional torture failed to break resolute heretics, the Inquisition turned to devices that transformed the human body into its own worst enemy. These weren't crude medieval barbarisms, but precisely engineered instruments, refined over centuries to exploit every nerve ending, every involuntary response, every shameful weakness flesh possesses. The iron chair waited in Toledo's deepest interrogation chamber, not hidden from shame but displayed prominently, allowing prisoners to contemplate its promise during preliminary questioning. Witnesses describe it with disturbing consistency: a throne-sized seat bristling with hundreds of iron spikes, each positioned to penetrate but not quite kill. Beneath, a brazier that could heat the entire chair until metal glowed red. Marguerite de Porret, a French mystic who wrote about divine love without church approval, met this chair in 1310. The inquisitors didn't immediately force her to sit. First, they made her watch another woman endure it, observing as spikes entered flesh with wet sounds that witnesses said resembled overripe fruit being slowly pierced. They made her count the screams, document the begging, watch urine and blood pool beneath the chair as the victim's body betrayed every dignity. When Marguerite's turn came, they added refinements. Her wrists were bound to the chair's arms, preventing the involuntary recoil that might provide momentary relief. Leather straps across her forehead forced her to stare forward at a mirror, watching her own face contort as dozens of spikes simultaneously entered her back, thighs, arms. The positioning was deliberate. No spike hit vital organs, ensuring consciousness throughout. But the true genius of the iron chair wasn't the spikes, it was the heating. As metal warmed, it cauterized wounds it created, preventing death from blood loss while amplifying agony beyond description. Flesh sizzled. The smell filled the chamber, that distinctive scent of cooking meat that survivors could never forget. Yet Marguerite lived for 3 hours in that chair, 3 hours of increasing heat, until finally her heart stopped from pure shock. The breast ripper served a different purpose entirely. This wasn't about confession, but transformation. Women accused of using their sexuality to spread heresy, and the Inquisition interpreted sexuality broadly enough to include any woman who attracted male attention, faced this device, specifically designed to destroy the physical markers of femininity. The device itself was simple: iron claws that could be heated or kept cold, depending on the desired effect. Cold ripping tore flesh raggedly, causing maximum blood loss. Heated claws cauterized as they destroyed, keeping victims conscious longer. The Inquisitor would grip these claws around breast tissue, then simply pull. Not quickly, that would be merciful, but slowly, sometimes over the course of an hour, tearing through layers of skin, fat, muscle, gradually revealing the chest cavity beneath. Anna Ruchman, accused of teaching other women to read scripture in 1428, endured the breast ripper twice. The first time destroyed her left breast. She was then given 3 days to reconsider her errors, while infection set into the massive wound. When she still refused to recant, they destroyed the right breast, this time using heated claws that filled the chamber with smoke from her burning flesh. She survived, if that word applies. Records indicate she lived another 4 years, chest wrapped in permanent bandages to hide the cavities where her breasts had been. Unable to work, unable to marry, unable to appear in public without causing revulsion, she became a living ghost haunting the margins of her former life until infection finally provided mercy. The pair of anguish, whether historical reality or legend, occupied a special place in the Inquisition's arsenal of gender-specific tortures. Shaped like a bulbous pear, this metal device could be inserted into any orifice, and then expanded via a screw mechanism. For women accused of sexual heresy, which could mean anything from adultery to refusing arranged marriage to simply being raped and blamed for it, the pair targeted the most intimate violations possible. Inserted vaginally and then expanded, it would tear internal tissues irreparably. The pain was described as lightning made solid, radiating through the entire pelvis and spine. But beyond immediate agony, it destroyed any possibility of normal bodily function. Women subjected to the pair often could never again control their bladders or bowels, adding lifelong humiliation to temporary torture. Yet the Inquisition's creativity didn't stop at mechanical devices. They perfected techniques requiring nothing but human bodies and infinite patience. The strappado involved binding a woman's wrists behind her back, attaching them to a rope thrown over a ceiling beam, then hoisting her until her feet left the ground. All body weight hung from backwards bent shoulders, gradually dislocating both joints over hours. But simple dislocation wasn't enough. They would attach weights to ankles, increasing the strain. They would suddenly drop the rope a few feet, then catch it, the jolt tearing muscles and ligaments. They would leave women hanging for days, lowering them just before death, allowing minimal recovery, then hoisting them again. Some women endured dozens of strappado sessions, their shoulders so damaged they could never again lift their arms above their waists. Isabel de la Cruz, leader of a mystical movement in Spain, faced a variation where her young daughter was suspended beside her. Isabel was told that recanting would lower her child. She held out for 6 hours, listening to her daughter's shoulders dislocate, before finally breaking. The child's arms never properly healed. She grew up unable to dress herself, a permanent reminder of her mother's heretical pride. The Inquisition understood that physical pain had limits. Bodies went into shock, minds dissociated. Death provided escape. So they developed tortures that used time as the primary weapon, extending suffering across weeks or months rather than hours. The Heretics' fork was elegantly simple, a metal rod with prongs at both ends, one placed under the chin, the other against the chest. A leather strap around the neck held it in place. The victim couldn't lower their head without driving prongs into their chest, couldn't raise it without piercing under their jaw, couldn't sleep without impaling themselves. They had to maintain perfect posture indefinitely, or suffer escalating self-inflicted wounds. Women wore these devices for weeks, fed by others since they couldn't look down at food, unable to speak without driving metal into their throats. Sleeping became impossible. Microsleeps resulted in stabbing pain that immediately woke them. After days without rest, hallucinations began. After weeks, complete psychological breakdown. Yet they remained conscious, aware, suffering every second until removal or death. These instruments weren't hidden away in shame, but blessed by priests before use. Torture sessions opened with prayer, asking God to guide the implements toward truth. The chamber's walls displayed religious paintings, typically Christ's crucifixion, with inscriptions suggesting that heretics' suffering paralleled divine sacrifice. The theological perversion was complete. Torture became sacrament. Agony became worship. Breaking women's bodies became service to God. But even these elaborate tortures paled before punishments that removed women from the world entirely, sealing them away while keeping them technically horribly alive. Stone and silence would succeed where iron and fire failed. Darkness has weight. After months in the Inquisition's cells, Sister Dulcina understood this intimately. But she was about to discover that compared to what awaited her, those cells had been luxury. The Inquisitor's voice echoed off stone walls as he pronounced her sentence. Immurement. The word meant nothing to her then. Within hours, she would understand it meant everything ending, except consciousness. Immurement was the Church's answer to a theological problem. Executing heretics created martyrs. Releasing them spread contamination. But sealing them inside walls, leaving them to die slowly in darkness, that was perfect. Technically not execution since the Church didn't kill them directly. Technically not freedom since they were more thoroughly imprisoned than chains could ever achieve. It was burial for the living, designed to last not hours but months or even years. The preparation ritual transformed punishment into perverse ceremony. Sister Dulcina was dressed in funeral clothes, a shroud that would become her only garment for whatever time remained. Priests performed last rites while she stood breathing, heart beating, fully aware of the mockery. The congregation sang hymns for the dead while she walked among them. They were erasing her from the world of the living before sealing her away. The procession to her tomb followed funeral protocols exactly. Mourners walked behind her as if following a casket. Bells tolled the death knell. Children threw flowers that struck her living flesh. The community performed grief for someone who could see them, Hear them. Feel their ceremonial tears that masked relief that it was her, not them, approaching the stone mouth that would swallow her forever. The cell itself had been prepared with nauseating precision. 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, 4 feet high. Too short to stand, too narrow to lie down properly, too low to sit upright. Every dimension calculated to deny comfort while preventing quick death. Stone walls 18 inches thick ensured no sound would escape. A single opening, 4 inches square, served as the only connection to the outside world. Through this would pass air, minimal food, and the constant reminder that life continued just inches away but forever unreachable. As Sister Dulcina entered, she had to crawl. The entrance was deliberately low, forcing her into submission before stone authority. Inside, she found her provisions, a water jug that would be refilled weekly if someone remembered, bread that would be passed through daily, maybe, a bucket for waste that would never be emptied, a single candle that would burn for perhaps 3 hours, then darkness forever. The ceiling was methodical, each stone placed with mortar, carefully fitted, creating an ever-shrinking square of light. She watched her escape route disappear brick by brick. Some women screamed during this process. Others prayed. Dulcina remained silent, saving her voice for later when silence would drive her to scream just to confirm she still existed. The final brick's placement created immediate, absolute darkness. Not the darkness of night where eyes adjust, shapes emerge, stars provide reference. This was darkness so complete it had physical presence, pressing against eyeballs, filling lungs, becoming indistinguishable from the stone surrounding her. Within hours, disorientation began. Without visual reference, her brain struggled to maintain position sense. Was she lying down or standing, facing the food slot or the back wall? The cell seemed to spin, shrink, expand. She would reach for walls that were closer than expected, bruising fingers on stone that shouldn't be there. Space became unreliable. Temperature never changed. The stone maintained constant coolness that seeped through her shroud, through skin, into bones. She couldn't generate enough body heat in the tiny space to warm it. She would never be warm again. Her muscles cramped from shivering, then cramped from the positions the cell forced, then cramped from lack of movement. Every position hurt. No position provided relief. But silence was worse than cold, worse than cramps, worse than darkness. Absolute silence, except for her own breathing, heartbeat, the sounds her body made that she'd never noticed before. The gurgle of digestion became thunder. Blood pulsing through ears became drums. She began talking to herself just to hear something external, but her voice sounded wrong, reflected off stone inches from her face, muffled and distorted until she wasn't sure if she was speaking or thinking. Time dissolved completely. Without sunrise or sunset, without meals at regular intervals, hours became meaningless. Had she been sealed for days, weeks? The bread came irregularly, sometimes moldy, sometimes not at all. She would ration it, counting bites to create structure, but would lose count, forget if she'd eaten, wonder if the bread was real or hallucinated. Thirst was constant. The water jug held perhaps 2 days' supply, but refills were erratic. She learned to drink her own urine when desperate, the warm salt preferable to the madness of dehydration. But this created shame that ate at her worse than hunger, the knowledge that she had become an animal drinking its own waste in darkness. The bucket filled, overflowed. The smell became part of her world, so constant she stopped noticing until infection set in. Sores developed where waste contacted skin. Without ability to clean herself, without space to avoid contamination, her body began rotting while she still inhabited it. She could smell her own decay, feel tissues breaking down, taste the sweetness of infection in her mouth. Sanity fled in stages. First went time sense, then spatial orientation, then the distinction between waking and sleeping. Dreams and reality merged. She would have long conversations with visitors who weren't there, confess to inquisitors who hadn't asked, beg forgiveness from God who didn't answer. The hallucinations were so vivid, she would reach for people who didn't exist, their absence more shocking than their appearance. Some immured women were given slightly larger cells, perhaps 6 feet square, with a small grated window. This wasn't mercy, but refined cruelty. They could see fragments of sky, watch seasons change, observe life continuing without them. They would press faces against grates until the metal left permanent marks, desperate for any connection to the world that had expelled them. Children walking past would dare each other to approach the grate, to look at the creature inside. Some threw stones, others food that the prisoner couldn't reach. A few kind souls might offer water or bread, but most hurried past, crossing themselves, teaching their children that this was what happened to women who questioned authority. The records are unclear how long Sister Dulcina survived. Some immured women lasted days, others endured for years. One documented case describes a woman immured in 1290 who was found still alive when the wall was demolished in 1321, 31 years later. She had forgotten language, forgotten her name, forgotten everything except the dimensions of her stone womb and the taste of her own flesh she'd gnawed from her arms when hunger became unbearable. When death finally came, it arrived slowly. Dehydration, starvation, infection, or simple surrender to despair. The body would consume itself, muscles eaten by metabolism, organs shutting down sequentially. But awareness persisted almost to the end, the curse of human consciousness that clings to life even when life has become worse than any imagined hell. The corpses were left in place. The cells became tombs. Eventually, decades or centuries later, renovation or demolition would reveal skeletons in positions that told their stories, curled fetal, trying to return to some remembered comfort, reaching toward the food slot, dying hope of salvation, scattered randomly where madness had driven them to destroy themselves against the walls. But for women whose heresies involved water, spreading their beliefs through baptism or blessing, the Church reserved a different element. Not the slow suffocation of stone, but the sudden shock of drowning, repeated endlessly until lungs and sanity both cracked. Water remembers everything. Joan Waste learned this in 1556 as they dragged her to the River Derwent. Blind since birth, she had memorized scripture by listening, then committed the unforgivable sin of reciting it to others in English rather than Latin. The crowd gathering at the riverbank knew her voice, had bought thread from her for years. Now they came to watch that voice fill with water until it could speak heresy no more. The Inquisition had evolved drowning from simple execution into elaborate ritual. Each element served dual purposes: punishment for the heretic, instruction for the audience. The entire community became complicit witnesses, their presence transforming murder into moral lesson. Joan's preparation began at dawn. They stripped her publicly, not completely, that would scandalize, but enough to ensure her clothing wouldn't help her float. They bound her thumbs to her toes behind her back, a position called the swimming rope that made any movement excruciating while ensuring she couldn't swim if the ropes somehow loosened. The pain from this position alone would have broken most people. Joints hyperextended, spine curved impossibly, breathing restricted to desperate gasps. But simple drowning was too quick. The Inquisition preferred the ordeal, the test, the divination that made God himself the executioner. Joan would undergo swimming, the water ordeal that claimed divine judgment, while guaranteeing death regardless of outcome. Float and supernatural evil was proven, requiring burning. Sink and innocence was established, though posthumously since drowning resulted either way. They attached the ducking rope around her waist, long enough to lower her fully underwater, but maintain control. This wasn't mercy, but mechanism for repeated submersion. The crowd would count to 30 for the first immersion. If she survived, they would pull her up for exactly 3 breaths, then submerge for 40 counts, then 50, then 60. The progression continued until she stopped moving. Here's what drowning actually does to the human body. Details the crowd couldn't see, but Joan experienced in microscopic detail. The first water entering lungs triggers laryngospasm, vocal cords slamming shut in desperate attempt to protect airways. This creates the sensation of suffocating while surrounded by the very substance that could relieve it, just opening your mouth. But opening means drowning, so the body fights itself, needing air, refusing water, locked in biological civil war. After 20 seconds, carbon dioxide buildup creates burning sensations throughout the chest. After 30, vision begins fragmenting into stars and darkness. After 45, involuntary breathing attempts begin, the body overriding conscious control. Water enters lungs, not in a flood, but in stuttering gulps, each one triggering coughing that draws in more water, creating a feedback loop of aspiration. The pain defies description. Survivors report feeling like their chest was filled with broken glass, every breath shredding internal tissues. The salt or minerals in river water create additional burning, while bacteria immediately begin attacking damaged lung tissue. Even if rescued at this point, secondary drowning could kill hours or days later, as lungs slowly filled with fluid responding to injury. Joan survived the first 4 immersions. The crowd grew restless. Some called for immediate burning since her survival suggested witchcraft. Others demanded continued swimming until God's will became clear. The inquisitors chose continuation, partly from procedure, partly from curiosity about how long a blind woman could endure what sighted people couldn't watch. The 5th immersion lasted 90 counts. Joan's body convulsed so violently that 3 men struggled to hold the rope. These weren't conscious movements, but primitive brainstem responses, the animal core fighting for survival while consciousness flickered. When they pulled her up, blood poured from her mouth and nose, lung tissue torn from violent coughing. She was still alive. Worse, she was still conscious, still whispering prayers in English between blood and water. This presented a theological problem. Survival suggested divine protection, but heretical prayers suggested demonic power. The solution was elegant in its cruelty. Continue the ordeal, but add weights to ensure proper sinking. They tied stones to her ankles, each one precisely weighed. Too heavy, and death would come quickly. Too light, and she might still float. The goal was slow submersion, fighting against drowning while being steadily pulled under. This transformed drowning from binary event to extended process, consciousness persisting even as water filled lungs. The 6th immersion began at noon. The stones pulled Joan down steadily but not immediately, giving her perhaps 30 seconds of struggle at the surface, gulping air mixed with water, before submersion became complete. The crowd watched bubbles rise, each one representing expelled air that wouldn't be replaced. After 2 minutes, the bubbles stopped. After 3, they raised her. She was unconscious, but breathing, shallow rattles that suggested massive pulmonary damage. The inquisitors declared this partial death proof of partial guilt. She would undergo 1 more immersion, this one designed to extract full confession through proximity to death. They would lower her until she signaled readiness to confess, then raise her to speak her crimes. But Joan had no more voice. Water and blood had destroyed her vocal cords. When they lowered her the 7th time, she couldn't signal, couldn't confess, couldn't do anything but die, silently beneath the surface while the crowd waited for signs that never came. They raised her after 5 minutes to find a corpse, eyes open, mouth stretched wide in the eternal gasp of the drowned. Yet even this wasn't the end. The body of a drowned heretic required special handling. Some regions burned them anyway, defeating the purpose of drowning but satisfying crowd bloodlust. Others hung the corpses at crossroads as warnings, letting them rot publicly until bones fell apart. Most commonly, they were buried at water's edge, neither fully on land nor in water, existing in liminal space matching their theological status. The variation called the cauldron targeted women accused of using water in their heresies, particularly those who performed unauthorized baptisms. A large metal pot would be filled with water, oil, or sometimes molten lead. The woman would be lowered slowly, feet first, allowing her to experience every inch of flesh entering the boiling liquid. Consciousness could persist until vital organs were reached, meaning several minutes of watching their own bodies cook. Catherine Saube, executed in 1550, faced a unique water torture. Accused of denying transubstantiation, she was force-fed consecrated wine until her stomach ruptured. The theological reasoning was exquisite in its perversity. If the wine was truly Christ's blood, it would save her. If not, she would die proving her heresy correct, but unable to benefit from being right. The tidal drowning, practiced in coastal regions, let nature perform the execution. Women were chained at low tide to posts positioned so high tide would cover them completely. They would watch water approach for hours, feel it rise incrementally, experience drowning in slow motion as waves gradually covered face. Survival, until the next low tide, just meant repeating the process. Mass drownings created their own horrors. When entire communities of heretic women were condemned, they would be tied together and thrown from bridges. The stronger swimmers would fight to surface, pulling others down. The weak would drag down the strong. They would drown each other in desperate attempts at survival, transforming execution into participatory murder where victims became instruments of their own destruction. Bridge drownings became public festivals. Vendors sold food and drink. Musicians played between executions. Children received treats for watching without crying. The normalization of watching women drown, turning it into entertainment, created generations desensitized to female suffering. But some women were too dangerous to simply kill. Their words had spread too far. Their influence persisted beyond death. For them, the Inquisition reserved its ultimate punishment: complete erasure from history itself. Prudence Clutterbuck dared to claim women could preach God's word in 1598. The authorities decided that before executing her, they would ensure she never spoke again. The device they locked onto her head was both punishment and preview. If she survived, she would never speak heresy. If she died, her last words would be metal and blood. This wasn't a simple gag. The scold's bridle was an iron framework that enclosed the entire head, with a carefully designed plate that pressed onto the tongue. But the plate wasn't flat. It bore spikes, sometimes one, sometimes several, positioned to pierce the tongue if the wearer attempted speech. Every word meant blood. Every sound meant pain. Silence became the only option, but even silence hurt as the spikes pressed constantly against soft tissue. Prudence wore this device for 6 months before her trial. 6 months of being unable to speak, unable to eat solid food, unable to clean the wounds in her mouth that festered and leaked pus down her throat. She was paraded through towns on market days, the bridle marking her as a dangerous woman whose words required caging. Children learned that women's speech itself could be criminal. The bridle's design revealed sadistic attention to detail. Bells were often attached, ringing with every movement, announcing the approach of the silenced woman. Eye holes were positioned to force downward gaze, preventing defiant eye contact. Breathing holes were minimal, enough to survive, but not enough for comfort. Some versions included screws that could be tightened, increasing pressure on skull and jaw until bones cracked. But the spikes were the true genius. Positioned to hit the tongue's most sensitive areas, they made swallowing agony. Saliva would build up, mixed with blood, choking the wearer. But swallowing meant driving spikes deeper. Women learned to let the mixture drip continuously, creating trails of blood and spit that marked their paths through town. This visible suffering was intentional, showing consequences of female speech. Margaret Fernseed wore a variation with multiple spikes arranged like a bed of nails across the tongue plate. She survived 3 years in this device, fed thin gruel through a funnel, never able to speak, scream, or even moan without agony. When finally removed for execution, her tongue had grown around the spikes, incorporating metal into flesh. Removal required cutting tissue away, leaving her unable to speak even without the bridle. The branks, the bridle's Scottish cousin, added elaborations. Some included nose clips that prevented breathing through nostrils, forcing mouth breathing that drove spikes deeper with each inhalation. Others had adjustable tongue plates that could be cranked forward, slowly pushing the tongue out of the mouth until it protruded grotesquely, swollen and purple, for public mockery. Women wearing branks were stationed at market crosses, human warnings about the danger of female speech. Placards hung around their necks detailed their crimes. Spreading false doctrine, speaking without husband's permission, corrupting other women with words. Passers-by were encouraged to interact, to test if the woman would try to speak despite the spikes, to witness the blood that resulted from attempts at communication. The witch's bridle included an iron bit, similar to those used on horses, forcing the comparison between unruly women and animals requiring breaking. The bit pressed against the soft palate, triggering constant gag reflex. Women wearing these often vomited repeatedly, but with the bit in place, they would aspirate their own vomit, drowning slowly in their own stomach acid while standing upright in public view. Some regions developed the gossip's bridle specifically for women who spread heretical ideas through conversation. These included not just tongue spikes, but also hooks that pierced cheeks from inside, making any facial expression agony. Smiling, frowning, even involuntary expressions of pain would tear flesh. The face became frozen in a mask of neutrality that gradually became permanent as muscles atrophied from disuse. The mathematical precision of spike placement suggests medical consultation. Anatomical knowledge was used to maximize pain while preventing quick death. Spikes avoided major blood vessels that would cause rapid bleeding out. They targeted nerve clusters for maximum pain transmission. They were long enough to prevent speech, but short enough to avoid piercing through to the throat where death might come quickly. Women developed desperate communication methods despite the bridles, finger signals, written messages when permitted, meaningful looks that tried to convey entire conversations through eyes alone. But authorities recognized and punished these attempts. Fingers that signed were broken, writing hands were burned, eyes that spoke too loudly were put out. The removal of bridles became events themselves. After months or years of wear, facial muscles had atrophied, jaw joints had frozen, tongues had been so damaged that speech was impossible regardless. Women would emerge from bridles unable to close their mouths, tongues swollen permanently, faces restructured by constant pressure. They had been transformed into living symbols of the danger of female speech. Children who witnessed bridal punishments grew up with deep associations between women's speech and danger. Daughters learned to speak softly, rarely, carefully. Sons learned that controlling women's words was natural, necessary, divinely sanctioned. Entire generations internalized that female silence was sacred while female speech was suspicious. But the bridle was just the beginning. For women whose influence persisted despite silencing, whose writings or teachings continued spreading even as they stood mute and bloodied in town squares, the Inquisition had one final solution. Not just silencing the woman, but erasing her entirely, making it as if she had never existed at all. History is written by the living about the dead. But what happens when the dead are erased before they die? When Marguerite Porete was executed for heresy in 1310, Burning was just the beginning of her planned obliteration. The Inquisition had developed a process called damnatio memoriae, inherited from Roman law but perfected for theological purposes. This wasn't just execution but existential deletion, removing not just the person but any evidence they had ever existed. The process began before death. Marguerite's name was formally struck from all records. Not crossed out, which would leave evidence, but carefully scraped from parchment with special knives, leaving smooth spaces where her name had been. Parish records of her birth, marriage documents, property deeds, any official acknowledgement of her existence was methodically destroyed or altered. Her family was given a choice: denounce her completely and change their surnames or share her fate. Most chose survival, abandoning family names that had been carried for generations. Her children were declared illegitimate retroactively, bastards with no legal father, since their mother had never legally existed to marry. They were forbidden from using her name, referring to her, or acknowledging she had been their mother. The physical erasure was equally thorough. Every possession she had touched was burned. Not just personal items, but anything that might carry her memory. Books she had read, even if orthodox, were destroyed because her eyes had seen them. Clothing was burned, furniture demolished. Even buildings she had lived in were sometimes razed to prevent them becoming shrines. Her writings, the theological works that had caused her arrest, received special treatment. Simply burning them wasn't enough. Each copy had to be hunted down across Europe, a process that took years and involved extensive spy networks. Anyone found possessing her work faced their own trials. Merely quoting her words, even to refute them, became evidence of heretical sympathy. But physical destruction was easier than memory erasure. People remembered Marguerite, her teachings, her presence. So the Inquisition developed techniques for destroying memory itself. Anyone who spoke her name publicly faced punishment. Private mentions were reported by networks of informants. Within a generation, speaking her name had become so dangerous that people forgot it from fear. The blank spaces method was particularly effective. Where Marguerite's name had been removed from documents, nothing was written in replacement. These gaps in text, these smooth parchment spaces, became more powerful than any name. They taught readers that some people were so dangerous that even their memory was forbidden. The absence became a presence, a hole in history that warned against whatever had been erased. Contemporary chroniclers were ordered to exclude her from their histories. Events she had participated in were rewritten without her. Theological debates she had influenced were described as if her arguments had emerged from nowhere. Her ideas, when they couldn't be entirely suppressed, were attributed to certain nameless heretics or forgotten blasphemers. Her execution itself was subjected to erasure. Official records state simply that justice was performed on that date, without specifying who faced justice or what form it took. Witnesses were forbidden from describing what they saw. Artists were banned from depicting it. The crowd that watched her burn was ordered to forget they had been there. Yet people remembered. Secret oral traditions preserved fragments. Hidden documents survived in monastery walls. Coded references appeared in orthodox texts. The Inquisition's attempt at perfect erasure failed because human memory resists obliteration. But they had succeeded in transforming Marguerite from a person into a ghost, a whisper, a warning about the fate of women who thought too much. The generational erasure was perhaps cruelest. Her grandchildren grew up not knowing their grandmother had existed. They inherited genetic material from a ghost, family traits from nowhere, psychological patterns from a deleted source. Entire family lines carried trauma from an origin they couldn't name, fear of authority they couldn't explain, silence habits they couldn't source. Property erasure created economic catastrophe. Everything Marguerite had owned became unclaimed, but claiming it required acknowledging connection to her. Valuable lands sat empty because no one dared assert inheritance rights. Family businesses collapsed because partners fled association. Wealth accumulated over generations evaporated overnight, leaving her descendants in poverty they couldn't contest. The burial erasure meant no grave, no marker, no place to mourn. After burning, her ashes were collected and scattered in running water to prevent any location becoming identified with her. Multiple rivers received portions to ensure no single place could claim her remains. Maps were edited to remove her birthplace. Census records were altered to show the population -1, as if she had been subtracted from existence. Artistic erasure extended to portraits, sculptures, any visual representation. Faces were chiseled from family portraits, leaving ghostly spaces surrounded by relatives. Tapestries were unwoven thread by thread where her image appeared. Illuminated manuscripts had pages carefully removed, leaving books that jumped mysteriously in narrative where she had appeared. The linguistic erasure was most insidious. Words she had coined, phrases she popularized, even grammatical constructions she favored became suspect. Language itself was edited to remove her influence. Scribes rewrote texts to eliminate expressions that might remind readers of her work. The evolution of vernacular theology was artificially stunted to prevent paths that led back to her ideas. Confession erasure forced those who had known her to deny their memories. Under torture, her friends swore they had never met her. Her students claimed their education came from elsewhere. Her own mother, broken by repeated interrogation, finally stated she had never had a daughter, that she must have imagined the child she raised. The scholarly erasure continues today. Modern historians struggle to reconstruct erased women because the erasure was so thorough. We know Marguerite existed primarily through her enemies' refutations, negative spaces in arguments that suggest a missing voice. Like detecting black holes through their effect on surrounding stars, we identify erased heretics through the distortions they left in Orthodox theology. Digital recovery techniques have recently revealed some erased texts, finding ghost impressions in parchment, chemical traces of removed ink. Each recovered name is a small victory against historical obliteration. But, for every woman we recover, hundreds remain permanently deleted, their existence reduced to statistical anomalies in population records. The Inquisition kept secret records of erasures, lists of names that were themselves forbidden. These metadocuments, recording what was being forgotten, were among the most heavily guarded secrets in Vatican archives. Even today, many remain sealed, protecting erasures that succeeded so completely we don't know what we don't know. Some women faced partial erasure, perhaps the cruelest fate. Their names survived, but everything else was deleted. We have lists of executed heretics with names but no crimes, no dates, no locations. These women exist as pure absence, names attached to nothing, identity without content. They achieved the opposite of fame, becoming famous for being forgotten. The erasure extended beyond death through prohibition inheritance. Descendants were forbidden from achieving prominence in any field, ensuring that genetic and cultural lines remained suppressed. Families were tracked for generations, marked invisibly but indelibly as carriers of erased heresy. Marriage restrictions, profession bans, education limitations, all continued the erasure through time. But the ultimate erasure was self-erasure. Women who learned about these punishments, who saw others disappear from history, began erasing themselves preemptively. They stopped writing, stopped teaching, stopped thinking publicly. They chose invisible lives over deleted deaths. The Inquisition's greatest success wasn't the women they erased, but the countless women who erased themselves from fear. We return now to that stone chamber beneath Toledo Cathedral. Maria de Cazalla no longer recognizes her name. After months of systematic destruction, psychological, physical, spiritual, she has become exactly what the Inquisition intended, a living absence, present but erased, breathing but already buried in history's silence. When they finally release her, if release is the word for transformation from one prison to another, she will join the thousands of women whose only crime was believing they could speak to God without male interpretation. She will wear her San Benito until it rots into her skin. She will serve in convents or brothels or families that were once her own. She will be paraded through streets on feast days, a walking reminder of the price of female spiritual autonomy. But Maria is fortunate, if fortune exists in such darkness. She will live. She will suffer, but she will live. Others faced fates that make her continued existence seem merciful. They were transformed into living symbols of male power over female faith. They were sealed in stone or drowned in rivers or erased so completely that we don't even know their names to mourn them. They experienced tortures that medieval chroniclers, men who described battlefield disembowelments with clinical precision, refused to fully document. Think about that refusal. These were not squeamish men. They detailed public executions, cataloged plague symptoms, described surgical procedures without anesthesia. Yet when documenting what happened to female heretics, they would write only the usual penalties were applied, or justice was served according to custom. What horrors were so extreme that even those accustomed to medieval brutality couldn't bring themselves to record them? The answer lies not in the physical tortures, extensive as they were, but in the systematic destruction of female spiritual identity. The Inquisition understood that killing women created martyrs. Breaking their bodies created symbols of resistance, but breaking their souls, erasing their existence, transforming them into living warnings, that created the silence they sought. Every punishment we've explored tonight served this singular purpose, demonstrating that women who claimed spiritual autonomy would face consequences worse than death. The interrogation chambers that extracted confessions to crimes women didn't know they'd committed, the servitude that transformed them into property of the institutions they'd challenged, the torture devices designed specifically for female bodies, the immurement that buried them alive, the drownings that let God himself become executioner, the bridles that caged their words, the erasure that deleted them from existence. These weren't random cruelties, but calculated communications. Each tortured woman became a message to every other woman. Stay silent, stay submissive, stay within the boundaries we've drawn for you. Dare to think, speak, believe independently, and you won't just die. You'll disappear. The effectiveness was devastating. Within generations, women's public religious expression virtually vanished from European Christianity. Female mystics who had once advised popes retreated into silence. Communities of religious women who had operated with relative autonomy submitted to male oversight. The vibrant tradition of female theological thought that had flourished in the early medieval period was systematically destroyed, its practitioners burned, drowned, erased. We know about Marguerite Porete only because one copy of her work survived, hidden in a monastery wall for centuries. We know about the Cathars because their enemies wrote about destroying them. We know about countless unnamed women only through the negative spaces they left in history, the gaps where their voices should have been. How many brilliant theological minds were silenced? How many spiritual innovations were suppressed? How many women's ideas do we now attribute to men because the true authors were erased? The Inquisition didn't just kill individual women. It committed intellectual genocide against half of Christianity's theological capacity. Modern historians estimate that between 40,000 and 60,000 women were executed as witches and heretics during the Inquisition's operation. But that number only counts official executions. It doesn't include those who died in custody, who killed themselves rather than face torture, who were murdered by mobs inspired by inquisitional rhetoric. It doesn't count the living deaths of servitude imprisonment, and social erasure. More importantly, it doesn't count the millions of women who self-censored, self-silenced, self-diminished, rather than risk accusation. For every woman who was tortured, thousands watched and learned to make themselves small, quiet, invisible. The Inquisition's true success wasn't in the women they destroyed, but in the women they trained to destroy themselves. The legacy persists. When we wonder why female voices are scarce in historical theology, why religious leadership remains predominantly male, why women's spiritual experiences are still viewed with suspicion, we're seeing shadows cast by inquisitional fires. The fear bred into countless generations doesn't disappear just because the torture chambers closed. Modern DNA studies have found genetic markers for trauma in descendants of persecuted populations. The terror experienced by women facing the Inquisition literally altered their genetic expression, passing down biological fear, responses to daughters who would never face an inquisitor, but would carry the cellular memory of those who did. We inherit their silence in our very genes. The documentation that survives, the fragments rescued from erasure, tells us that these women were not passive victims. They resisted with extraordinary courage. They maintained their beliefs despite torture. They taught others despite death sentences. They wrote and spoke and prayed in their own languages, their own words, their own faiths, knowing the price they would pay. Some smuggled messages from prison, writing on cloth with their own blood when denied ink. Others created coded theological works that appeared orthodox but contained hidden heresies. Many refused to confess, even under the most extreme tortures, dying with their truths intact, if not their bodies. Their resistance matters because it shows that no system of oppression, regardless of how comprehensive, how brutal, how divinely sanctioned it claims to be, can completely suppress the human drive for spiritual autonomy. The Inquisition had unlimited power, unlimited resources, unlimited time, yet they failed to achieve their ultimate goal. Women continued to think, believe, and, when possible, speak their own truths. Today, when women's religious authority is debated, when female spiritual leadership is questioned, when women's theological perspectives are marginalized, we are still fighting battles that began in inquisitional chambers. Every woman who claims religious authority, despite institutional opposition, carries forward the resistance of women who faced drowning cages and bridle spikes for the same claim. The stones of those chambers still exist. You can visit them, touch walls that witnessed unimaginable suffering. But what you can't touch are the absent voices, the erased names, the deleted thoughts of women whose crime was believing their souls belonged to themselves. Their silence is louder than any scream, their absence more present than any monument. They were not witches or demons or heretics. They were women who read, who thought, who spoke, who believed they could approach the divine without male mediation. They were midwives who knew healing herbs, scholars who could read Latin, mystics who experienced God directly, teachers who shared knowledge with other women. They were dangerous not because they were evil, but because they were autonomous. The Inquisition ended officially in 1834, but its methods evolved rather than disappeared. Women who challenge religious orthodoxy still face punishment, if not bridals and drowning, then silencing, shaming, exclusion. The tools have changed, but the intent remains. Controlling female spiritual expression through fear. When we remember these women, we must remember them not just as victims, but as theological pioneers who paid the ultimate price for claiming spiritual equality. They expanded the boundaries of religious thought, even as those boundaries were violently enforced. They created space for female faith, even as that space was brutally collapsed. They spoke truths that powerful men spent centuries trying to silence. Their legacy lives in every woman who reads sacred texts for herself, who prays in her own words, who teaches her daughters they can speak directly to the divine. It lives in female clergy, theologians, religious scholars who exist because women before them refused to accept that God speaks only through male voices. Maria de Cazalla died in 1539, 4 years after her release from the Inquisition. She died in the convent where she served as slave, still wearing the San Benito that marked her as heretic. Her last words, whispered to a fellow condemned woman, were preserved in that woman's own final confession. They can chain my body, cage my voice, erase my name, but my soul speaks directly to God, and no inquisitor can stand between us. She was wrong about one thing. They did erase her name. For centuries, she existed only as a woman executed for heresy in Toledo. Modern scholars recovered her identity through painstaking research, comparing dates, places, partial records, until Maria de Cazalla emerged from historical silence. But for every Maria we recover, hundreds remain nameless. They are the shadows in history's margins, the silences between documented events, the statistical anomalies that suggest massive suffering we can quantity but not qualify. They deserve more than footnotes. They deserve recognition that their suffering built the foundations of religious freedom we now take for granted. So remember them. Remember the tortured, the drowned, the burned, the erased. Remember that heresy was often just literacy, that witchcraft was often just knowledge, that blasphemy was often just believing women had souls worth saving. Remember that every freedom of thought, speech, and belief we possess was paid for in women's blood, women's screams, women's silence. Remember Maria de Cazalla, kneeling on cold stone, whispering prayers in Spanish while the Inquisition tries to break her. Remember that she survived, scarred but unbroken in spirit. Remember that we know her name only because other women risked their lives to preserve fragments of her story. They were not just killed, they were silenced. They were erased. But we remember, and in remembering, we resurrect them. In speaking their stories, we give them back their voices. In learning their fates, we honor their sacrifice. They were told they would disappear from history. They were wrong. They are history, and their shadows remind us that the price of silence is always higher than the price of speech, even when speech costs everything. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.